Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with us today. We hope that the next 55 minutes or so will be of interest to you all. My name is Lucy Cording. I'm a partner at Kekst CNC, and I'm responsible for leading and building our digital and our insights capabilities. But I've also have a specialism and a lot of experience in employee communications and employer branding initiatives as well for my clients. I'm joined by my colleagues James and Tom, who will be introducing themselves properly in a moment. But before I do, I'd just like to take a moment just to set the scene a little bit in terms of what we are planning to do with our time today and what we're hoping to get out of it, and hopefully impart some wisdom to you all. So we've spent the last few months researching and polling public perception in light of COVID-19. James and Tom are really the experts here in terms of the analysis and the data. But the role that I will be playing today is to add that so what? What now for businesses, for employees, and for those responsible for building a culture and maintaining business purpose as well. If you do have any questions throughout, please do raise your hand or participate in the chat function. We will be taking questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to James and Tom, who can do a bit of intro and also talk you through the methodology to our research.
Great, thank you, Lucy. Hi, everybody. I'm James Johnson. As Lucy says, I'm joined by Tom Lubbock. We both previously ran polling and research for the UK Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street, and we've been at Kekst CNC since the start of the year running the research programme. One of the things we've done is a monthly COVID-19 opinion tracker across 6 markets, and we've also done some bespoke polling products as well, particularly on this question of employees, how they feel about the world, how they feel about their work, how they feel about their employers, and what they want to see come next, which is what we'll be talking, all of which we'll be talking about today. For the purposes of this survey, we've done sort of 2 polls here. One that took place a little earlier in the summer across 7 markets. You can see them here: the UK, Sweden, Germany, France, the US, Japan, and Hong Kong. And a follow-up survey in September, which took place in the first 6 countries: UK, US, Sweden, Germany, France, and Japan. They're nationally representative surveys, and we've obviously drilled down by employee. And we're also able to look at employees by different characteristics, such as the size of their company, sort of where their headquarters are, whether it's domiciled or international, as well as income and age. So hopefully we can leave you with a picture of, basically, what is the average sort of employee feeling, thinking, hoping for, and wanting, both in the next couple of months as the COVID crisis continues, but also as they come out of it. So I'll hand over to Tom, who's going to take us through the sort of first half of the findings, and then he'll come back to me. And I know Lucy's going to come in as we go as well. So over to you, Tom.
Thanks, James, and thanks, Lucy.
Thanks, Tom.
Do you want to talk to this first slide, Lucy, with a summary, or are you okay for me to talk to it?
Let me just do it very quickly. So I think just in summary, what we've done is we've taken those 2 surveys that James has just talked us through, and has allowed us to take away 5 key takeouts and learnings that we're going to use to navigate our way through the next hour or so in this discussion. So we're really looking at how impact of COVID has impacted our employee expectations, demands, perceptions, but also what that actually means in terms of where we should be going as businesses. What should we be focusing on? How frequently should we be communicating to one another? So we'll use these 5 key takeouts to talk through in more detail. And so, yeah, Tom, I'll hand it back over to you so we can talk first.
Okay, great. So the first section we want to talk about involves employees demanding change and what they're expecting their employers to support them with new ways of working. So if we go on to the next slide, having sung the praises of our research project over the last 5 waves, actually this first slide is data that we've acquired from elsewhere, but put our own filters and interpretation on. This is Google mobility data. And as you can see from the top left of the slide, we're looking at change compared to the baseline for people working at their normal place of work. So, for example, in the United States, the current position is that 32% less people are working at their normal place of work. They're down 32% on the same time last year. And you can see that the pattern here across these markets is that regardless of where the country is in terms of the pandemic and its own epidemic, there is a significant reduction in the proportion of people who are at their normal place of work. But when we actually look at the micro patterns here, they're actually quite different between markets. So perhaps the UK and the United States are perhaps the simplest cases, in that the initial drop was very, very large. And we saw in the UK, for example, at the beginning of April, there were 70% fewer people in their normal place of work compared to the baseline. So that, I mean, which is quite a dramatic finding. And that happened very quickly. And since then, there's been a very slow and gradual pickup in the UK in terms of people going back to their normal workplace. And interestingly, this seems to be somewhat immune to government guidelines, which is an interesting finding in some of these markets, that employees and employers are finding the right balance themselves. There's not big cliff edges here in the UK when guidance has changed. We've seen slow and steady return to work, even despite the UK government actually reimposing its work from home if you can guidance at the in the middle of September. You can see that it's had very little effect on the proportion of people who are actually at their normal workplace rather than working from home. I suppose other cases to pick out are Germany and Japan, because I think we all know that the epidemic hasn't hit Germany and Japan as hard as it has some of these other countries. And yet still we see the same kind of patterns in terms of people staying away from the workplace, not being at their normal workplace. Japan obviously has the most people back at work, but still, despite the very few number of cases in Japan, there's still a significant proportion who are not working at their normal workplace. And the same in Germany. And you can see it's actually started to tail off again in Germany. Hong Kong's interesting because obviously it was very hit very early and have had a very small but rapid drop off in terms of the proportion who weren't working at their normal workplace. It picked up in the middle of June, and then it's dropped off again and it's picked up a bit, but it's still 16% below where it was. France has also seen a kind of a double dip, but has now picked up to 17 points below where you were. I guess the final takeaway from this slide is where the situation lies now. We can see that the United States and the United Kingdom, the two Anglo countries, are very much of a piece as to where they've landed in terms of the proportion of workers who've actually been encouraged back to their workplaces. They're a third down, essentially. And then Germany and France are both in a similar position in that they are about just under a fifth down. Japan and Hong Kong, again, similar position in terms of, 9, 10, 15% down, so it's a bit less. And then Sweden's probably in the German and the French column here. So we've kind of got three different bands of markets here that have landed in very different equilibriums in terms of who's working from home, who's back at their normal workplace. So really interesting findings there, and we'll look at how those evolve as this mobility data continues to flow. Should we go to the next slide, Lucy?
Yeah, and I suppose before we do, just to say as well, I think that obviously these fluctuations mean that as a business trying to maintain a sense of direction, a sense of purpose, building a culture or evolving, protecting a culture is going to be incredibly difficult to do that, because as we all know, these things are changing probably on a weekly, sometimes daily basis. And so there's a real challenge that we're all facing to try and manage that. And I think there's probably the productivity issue, there's the well-being of our employee base issue, but then it's also about that culture and driving success in the future and getting on with the normality. So we'll consider some of those implications as we move forward.
Great. Fabulous. This is a question we asked from our Kekst CNC COVID tracker. And we're essentially looking at what significant changes employees are going to make to the way they live and the way they work over the next 12 months. We gave them a series of options, and these were the ones that were almost, the employees said they were almost certain that they were going to do, or that they were inclined to do but hadn't done yet. So, for example, we see in the UK, 62% of employees say they're almost certain or inclined to commute by car or bike rather than by train, subway, or bus. A huge, overwhelming majority of employees saying that they're going to make that change to commuting. But really, the one that stood out for us is that this split that between home working and office working, this balance that just under a majority of employees said in most of these markets that they really wanted to do in the next 12 months. So you can see there, 35% in the UK want to do split working between home and office, 33% in Germany, 28% in Japan, 43% in Hong Kong, which is really high figure, 42% in the US, 32% in Sweden, and 37% in France. So, you know, a really significant chunk of employees, and bearing in mind that not all employees are going to have that option in the first place. They're not going to all have the ability to work from home at all, let alone to do that split. Those are large proportions of those who could do that, saying that that's something they want to do in the next 12 months. And then obviously, whilst we thought that was the most interesting finding, clearly these changes to commuting are absolutely fundamental to what's going to happen in the next 12 months and what's already happening. So this shift away from public transport, which has obviously been the mantra for the last generation, really, that public transport is the future of mobility. Well, I mean, according to these findings, that is very much on the way out, and people are going to switch the way that they commute to car and bike, and that is going to have real implications for where they want to be. You know how that commute works for them. So, you know, really large proportions of employees saying this is a change they want to make. In Germany, it's half. Japan, just under half. France, well over half. Sweden, well over half. So really substantive change there. And then we look at some of these activities and changes that are not quite as widely adopted, but still you've got significant proportions adopting. So, for example, in Germany, you've got 20% who say they want to leave their job permanently for some time off. That figure's 12% in Japan, 20% in Hong Kong. That's a significant chunk of employees saying that this is something they want to do. So that's something to really bear in mind. And we found slightly less support than I think we expected for moving house to the countryside. That attracts about a tenth of people in most of the 10th to a fifth in most of these markets. So some interesting lesser supportive findings there when you think about how many employees 10% of the workforce is. They're still very significant chunks. I'll hand back to Lucy. Anything in terms of implications? What do you think the implications of this is?
So I think there's lots to consider. I think there's a short-term piece, but there's also the longer-term planning as well, especially as we're considering different modes of transport to get into the office, different expectations. I do think that there is an interesting perception in terms of childcare and flexible working as well, what we call flexi working or agile working. What does that actually mean now? And how do we really define that? And I think that as an organization, we need to be considerate of how we communicate that, number one, but actually, how do we support that going forward? And so really thinking about that kind of longer term resource planning, office configuration, workspace planning, it has some serious implications, as I said earlier, not only to kind of the everyday and the logistics, but also the success of the business going forward. I don't know, Tom, if you wanted to talk through some of these or whether you think they've been covered in the previous.
These are, I'll just run through these because these are actually kind of like our headline figures from that last slide. So putting aside those big trends that I pointed to, a fifth of workers in the UK are likely to change their work pattern, so they're home more for childcare. I think we're going to talk more about this, about childcare and the gender gap later. 4 in 10 US workers say they're likely to ask their employer if they can work from home permanently. 2 in 5 in Hong Kong are likely to split their work between home and the office. That trend that we were pointing to, and a fifth of workers in Sweden are looking for a move out to the countryside. Now, how do they balance that? Is that a question of work from home in the countryside, or is it a question of finding employers who are located for them, more conveniently for them? And then finally, in France, 62% of employees are now more likely to commute by car or bike and avoid public transport. So, I mean, that for a survey like this, that is a high percentage. Really interesting trend for employers to keep an eye on.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, so this is another question that we asked about the percentage of workers who are very likely to ask to work from home permanently in the next 12 months. This we tried to split this up by company size. So you'll see that it's actually workers from larger companies who are more likely to have this ask. And we found that 42% of 18 to 45-year-olds in the US say they're likely to leave their job permanently for some time off as well. So really interesting firmographics there. There's larger firms more likely to have employees who are going to demand these changes than smaller firms.
I think also the age bracket analysis is also important for us to consider, because I was actually having a conversation with a contact of mine a couple of weeks ago, and she made a very, very, very good point around our junior colleagues. And I'm not talking about at Kekst CNC, I'm just talking more generally in the workforce, in the city, and the businesses that we work in. Our junior colleagues are at risk of not being able to learn and develop on the job, so to speak. So we know from being in the office that people pick things up from listening to people on the phone. People pick up things when they hear or they see others leading by example. And so the impact that has on organizations to try and maintain that learning and developing and that future proofing of skill sets, we're going to have to start thinking about other ways to do that. How do you replicate some of that on the job experiences that we just naturally tend to do on a daily basis? How do we do that in a virtual world or a hybrid model? So again, thinking about that future skill set is something that I would advise my contacts to think about and my clients to think about, putting those things into place to preempt some of those softer skills that people just generally pick up being in the office.
Good stuff. Should we look at the next slide?
Yes, next one. This one.
Oh, mine's being slow to update.
Okay, I thought we were on slide 9, so I'll stay there. Can you see that, Tom, with the word cloud?
No, mine's not updated. There we go. Perfect, thanks. So we actually asked some free text questions in this survey too. And the question we asked here is, in a sentence, what's the one thing you want your employer to do differently after the coronavirus pandemic? So trying to really get at responses that might be offered freely, and we might not have thought of by presenting a series of options to the respondents, to the employees. But actually, the overwhelming thing that came through in this free text question, as you see from this word cloud, is the word home. It's about home and flexibility. There's some mention here in this word cloud of masks, of health and safety, of PPE, of environmental practices, but really you can't avoid this overwhelming focus on home working and flexibility. And this is, I should say, this is just for employees in the UK and the US. We didn't translate all those answers in those other markets, but this is a good chunk of employees who filled in this free text answer. And I think it really a very simple, clear message there. The other things about safety, about social distancing, about all the things we've now become used to are in there, but really this overwhelming focus on home working and flexibility.
I think, Tom, also this is a really good example of a piece of advice that I would give as well to anyone listening or watching, is the fact that this is just taken from our survey and it looks at the UK and the US, and there's a very clear message. But in order to support that transparency and that learning environment of, we're all in this together and we're all going through a journey together, those internal surveys, those live temperature checks, those pulse checks, whatever you want to call them, are going to be incredibly important, even as we move through the forward months and even years, because I know a lot of companies lent on these types of surveys internally to get a feel about what was going on within the business and what they needed to do, but they need to continue. There's also a role for leaders as well to be the role models in their communications and how they are dealing with working from home, and the fact that they also have a perception of what they want to do differently during the pandemic as well, even if they're the senior leadership of the business. So the importance of them telling their personal stories will also give a really, really significant and important message to their employer base, as well as in hand kind of that longer term vision of the company. Again, it's bringing those people on the journey and being very open about what they're hearing and what they need to change going forward.
Yeah, I think you also can't underestimate the importance of, as you say, Lucy, of doing that research, of doing this kind of research on a more micro scale in each firm to find out what flexibility means for different groups of employees, because flexibility by its very definition is undefined. It's going to vary by different groups of employees. And so what we found, I think, with clients is that it's really important for them to find out what their, as you say, what their employees think flexibility means, and whether different types of employee have different definitions of it.
Exactly.
So we asked these really interesting questions about the gender gap and productivity. So we wanted to see whether there's a gendered effect to productivity changes during the pandemic, during this incredible period of home working. And what we found is that men have actually been more likely to see their productivity increase, as we suspected, since the start of this coronavirus pandemic, than women in the UK and the US. Japanese workers report much lower productivity, which is a really interesting finding. But you see here, if we just look at the graph, say, of the US, that you've got 20% of men down in the bottom middle saying that their productivity has increased a lot during the coronavirus pandemic. And you can see that is plausible, much as some of us would love for that to have been the case. But only 11% of women saying their productivity has increased a lot. Same with increased a little. 20% of men in the US say their productivity has increased a little. but only 16% of women say the same. 59% of women say it stayed the same, 46% of men stayed the same, and then decreased a little, 10% of men, 9% of women, and decreased a lot, 4% of men, 5% of women. So women are not getting that productivity benefit from working at home at quite the same rates as men in the US. And we'll see a similar pattern in the UK. Then in Japan, you see those in the top middle, you see those big decrease figures. So 22% of Japanese employees have said, 22% of men in Japan have said that their productivity has actually gone down. The amount of work they can do in a week is the way we phrased it. And 17% of women have actually found the same. 9% decreased a lot for men, and 10% of women say their productivity has decreased a lot. Interestingly, in Sweden and Germany, we see that those kind of gender effects are really not there and not as marked. And in Sweden, actually, if you combine increased a lot and increased a little, women actually say that their productivity has gone up more than men, which is really interesting, with little to no change on the decrease. And similar story in Germany. I think it's very much a dead heat in Germany between men and women, and actually on decrease, men say their productivity decreased a bit more during the pandemic. So really interesting effects by market there, but we find an interesting gender gap in the UK and the US, and I think Lucy's going to say what that means for employers.
Yeah, I think also, I think we're just conscious of time, Tom, so I think we might move forward to the key takeouts. I think we've covered a lot of that implications already, but I suppose moving on to the key takeout, the fact is really employers are facing increasing pressure to take a responsibility for the mental and physical well-being and health of its employees. And that's only going to become more complex as the pandemic continues. And so we're going to now focus on actually what that means in terms of that pressure and how we can be seen to respond to that.
Good stuff. So this is another question that we asked in the Kekst coronavirus tracker. Let's start with one headline from the UK. The net score that British employees gave to their firms for instituting health and safety measures was 51%. That's a massive boost for British employers in terms of the view that their employees have. And actually what we see here is a really good news story for employers. So when it comes to creating a feeling that we're all in it together, in all markets, we found that employees were willing to give a positive rating to their employer. And the same for creating a positive working environment, apart from Japan. So Japan was an outlier, as we saw in terms of employee productivity. Japan was a bit of an outlier, but in all these other markets, we're finding net positive ratings for employers on all these metrics that we asked employees about: giving a strong voice, helping with public health efforts, very strong ratings there, +30 in most of these markets. Improving diversity of senior management, slightly less strong positive signals there, but still net positive overall. Instituting health and safety measures, one of the key things employers have had to do during the pandemic. Incredibly strong ratings, as I said, in the case of the UK and other markets. And then slightly less strong again for keeping employees' pay levels at reasonable levels, but still net positive outside of Japan. So all those actions that employers have been taking have really been paying off with employees. That's the news we're finding here.
And I think also they're very, very sensitive, or can be very sensitive, which are often open to scrutiny anyway. So even more challenging for that employer action to be communicated effectively. And I think that obviously does move on to our next key takeout, which is for me, really, really interesting as a communicator and a comms professional is being able to understand the reaction that employees will have to the substance and the frequency of those employer-driven communications. And I think it's really important to also point out the fact that we're not necessarily just talking about internal communications, although we will be covering that in a moment, but just more broader than that. How, as an employer, how do I communicate effectively in the outside world through media, through advocacy measures, through senior leadership LinkedIn profile, so many different touch points. And there's a real need to be really mindful of their combined impact of all of those different touch points and how there is a need for them to be consistent in tone, etc. But let's dive into some of the findings that we took. I think I'm handing over to James now, who's going to talk us through some of the lessons on this particular topic.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Yeah, so what we've done here is we've asked employees to basically rate how well or badly a job their company is doing on a range of different things, very similar to the graphs we've just looked at. And it's interesting because we were able to compare countries, which we'll do in a moment, but we're also able to deep dive into how particular countries' employees are doing. We've zoomed in on the UK here because although things are broadly pretty positive, there are clearly some places where British employees want their companies to do more. So what we've got here is we've basically got we've asked them to give ratings out of 10 on a range of different things in terms of how their employers are performing. And the key thing to look at here really is the green shading, which is the percentage of those who've rated their employer really quite badly. And you'll see there's not that many. It's usually no more than 20% or so. But that is still a significant amount of employees who are pointing out problems. And the one that is that employees are most critical about is that second one from the bottom, whether their company or organization is checking how they're doing and whether they're facing any issues, challenges, or concerns. So that's obviously important in the context of where we are, in the midst of the pandemic. And as we go through, this real sense from employees that, they want their companies to be doing that. And as I say, 1 in 5 in the UK are actually saying they're not doing a particularly good job. So that checking in, really, really important. Other ones that are rated a bit better, this sense about employment and job safety. So the third one down, senior management delivering a clear message about employment and job safety to its employees. That rates very well. That tallies with what Tom was saying about health and safety, and also the top one, company or organization introducing digital tools for efficient communications. Generally speaking, done a better job there. But this checking in, and also the long-term strategy point, I think this is a really key point, the bottom one on that graph, whether their company or organization is clearly conveying long-term company strategy. Not that many saying they've done a bad job, but significantly fewer saying that companies have done a good job of that. So that gives the sense that perhaps UK employees are a little bit ambivalent about how their company's done on that, perhaps suggesting they haven't had as much outreach on long-term company strategy as perhaps they'd like to. So health and safety, digital tools, video conferencing, working remotely, a pretty good score for employers. But updates, keeping up to date, checking in with employees, and that long-term strategy, perhaps room for improvement for British employers, at least going by this survey.
And I think just looking at the diversity of the topics that as an employer you need to be considerate of when you're communicating, I think it does go back to my point I made a moment ago around the need to almost take that pause and that moment to really think about how all of that plays out across all of your different touch points, whether it is a town hall, whether it is a website, whether it is an internal communications, how they all work together, how they're consistent. And also I think as well, the advice I would give would be to really think about the measurement and impact of each individual touch point, because you might have to revisit and rejig and reapproach how you communicate and how frequently you communicate as well, if it's not having the desired influence and impact that you wanted it to.
Yeah, and there's an income element to that as well, because in this survey, we're finding that workers on lower incomes are rating their employer less highly on that company strategy point. I imagine that links to confidence and job security, concerns about wage, concerns about potential redundancy. So again, just a really important point from employees there, particularly those ones on lower income, that they really want to see that certainty. Just quickly, I don't think this slide needs too much of a voiceover, but it's just looking at this on a global level. So the same graph, but on a global level. And it just gives you a sense of some of the comparisons. So, the UK is pretty much in the middle of the field in terms of how employees rate their employers. US employers feeling much better overall about their employer. But it's interesting, Japan and Sweden. In Japan and Sweden, employees really rating their employer quite a lot less well on a lot of those metrics. We knew Japan was like that from the previous slides, but interesting that Swedish employees are also feeling frustrated there. But otherwise, the trend is similar in terms of health and safety, pretty good ratings, but long-term strategy and checking in less well.
So moving on to our fourth takeout, and this was something again I found very, very interesting, and I think that we've all heard the increase of importance around climate and sustainability commitments, or longer term purpose and diversity initiatives, and the commitments that the business is seen to be supporting in the longer term. But actually, what our analysis and survey showed us was a very clear message around what employees want. And it's very much focused on putting me first, and James will talk you through some of the details here, but it is around the prioritization around their own pay, their job, but also their health and safety as well.
Yeah, great. I think this is really, if there's sort of one thing to impress on you from today, I think this would be it from my perspective. We're at this stage now where we're seeing resurgences of the virus in most of these markets, and we've seen employers do pretty well, broadly speaking, as we've seen in terms of how they've been perceived to have done throughout the pandemic. But now, what do employees want from their employer for the next 3 months? As we move into this winter, where are their priorities? And as Lucy refers to, and you can see on this graph, it's really a great deal of it is focused around that sort of personal circumstances of the employee. Top of the mark, in average terms, is keep employees' pay levels at a reasonable level. Then it's institute health and safety measures in the workplace. Then it's protect jobs and prevent redundancies. And then also in the top 4 is support employees with working from home. You can see on protecting jobs, preventing redundancies, that's actually by quite a significant margin the top concern in the UK and also the top concern in the US. So, we are shifting from a world in which back in March and April, when we asked questions like this, help with public health efforts was right at the top for employers. The employees were looking at the crisis and they were saying, I want my employer to get involved. I want them to help the NHS. I want them to help health services, whatever it might be. Now, actually, there is a bigger tilt to the personal, to myself. I want you to protect my job. I want you to protect my pay. I want you to make me safe if I have to come into work. So real focus on that, which is really important. We also see supporting employees working from home. That's particularly prominent in the US and in Sweden. And we also see the picture in Germany that it's also about mood. It's also about tone, building a feeling that we're all in this together as a firm organization, firm/organization. That comes to the top in Germany. One final thing from me on this one is that if you look at the bottom of the chart, what isn't resonating so much are those things that we obviously talk about quite a lot, whether it's environmental initiatives or improving diversity. Now, that's not to say that those things aren't important. They clearly are in terms of investment and in terms of how people choose and decide on which brands or businesses or places to work for. What we're saying, though, is that in terms of these next 3 months, employees are really saying, look, I know that stuff's important and I know that's still something we have to focus on, but what I really care about over the next 3 months is me. and I don't want you as a firm to lose sight of that. That's really the clear message we're getting through from these employees. Focus on me, focus on those concrete things that are going to make me feel economically safer in this very turbulent next 3 months.
Thanks, James. So we're moving on to our fifth and final takeout. And I suppose just actually building on what you've just been saying, James, around the kind of the importance of the individual and the employee. And I suppose for us, as we're thinking about taking some key takeouts and lessons from the survey and the 2 surveys that have been conducted over the last couple of months, we've obviously talked a lot about employee engagement and employee communications and employer branding. Well, actually, we also know that there is an importance to focus on aligning the corporate reputation, the corporate branding. So the employer branding and the corporate branding to go very much hand in hand. And the challenge that any organization will face, considering what you've just said, James, in the sense that there is ultimately, especially in the immediate future, a need to really be focusing on the well-being of and the priorities of their employee base. So how do you then combine that with the longer term planning, the business objectives, business building, business generation? So there's a protection piece, of course, and a lot of organizations are having to go through that, but also thinking about your ambitions for the future and the kind of survival and the growth phase, as well as the transformation phase and the protection phase. So just in summary, I want to just talk you through 4 key areas which I believe are incredibly important for us as communicators, as business professionals, and anyone in charge of that corporate positioning or that brand building or brand protection, because there are longer term implications of this changing workforce and changing workforce behavior that we've talked you through today. So the first one is around talent attraction, and that obviously goes hand in hand with the employee side. There's a real need for businesses and their communications and their efforts and their actions to be seen to be empathetic to any job losses, of course, but also in parallel still be able to speak confidently to their ambitions, where they're going to go, how they're going to recover, how are they going to survive, because that has to be, they have to be mindful of their existing talent and what they're looking for from a leader or from an employer, but also the people that they probably want to attract to the business, maybe not now, but in the future. How a business has survived or taken their employees through this journey and through this turbulent time will speak volumes for their future efforts, especially when they're trying to attract maybe harder to reach specialist skills in digital, for example. The second piece is around really thinking differently and about your gender equality and broader diversity ambitions as well. We know that these changing working environments are disrupting the way that we all behave, the way that we operate, and just being mindful of the different nuances that each individual may have, depicted by their gender or their race or their ethnicity, or where they're located, or if they have children or don't have children. Again, it's this personal implication that every business will need to be aware of. And so thinking about how you continue those pulse checks that I mentioned before, but also just keep learning and listening to the differences of behavior and opinion of your employee base will be paramount to the success of how you really approach your D&I commitments and ambitions. The third is around executive profiling, and I've talked already about the role of senior leaders being more visible and more empathetic and more responsible. And this is something that we're talking to a lot of our clients about on a daily basis, is being able to really consider the role that senior leaders, senior spokespeople have within the business, and actually what skill sets they need to learn as well. So we're all going through these changing environments together, and in some instances, your CEO, your senior leadership board may need coaching themselves, or changing how they act and perform online or through virtual conferences or town halls, etc. And so really considering the coaching environment is going to be very important. And then finally, a subject that I'm very, very passionate about, and this is around employee advocacy. This is around giving the structure and the program and the motivation to all of your employees to advocate where they work. That might be difficult in these challenging times and may be difficult if they're all working from home. How do you support your ambassador programs that you probably have already started implementing in a hybrid working model? How do you capture that essence of a sense of pride and achievement? So that's a challenge, but the results and the benefits of doing that are going to be notable. If you can continue that dialogue and that sense of culture and happiness of being a place of work, that will help not only in your talent attraction and retention efforts, but also will spill out into your corporate reputation and reputation management building as well. So that's it from us in terms of our slides. Just checking the time. We have 10 minutes left for any questions or comments to James, Tom, or I. I can't see my screen to see if anyone has actually submitted or put their hand up. James or Tom, I don't know if you can see.
No, I guess nothing through yet. But I guess while we're waiting, I think just to go back on what you were saying there, Lucy, I think one of the key things that we're really I think not saying here is it's not a sort of zero-sum game between these longer-term diversity, environmental priorities, and looking after your employee now. I mean, it's just I think the key thing that we're flagging is that sort of question of emphasis, and just always being aware, and that actually when you do a survey like this, when you do the polling and you go back to the employees themselves. It is just that helpful reality check that in that context of the next 3 months, they are very focused on their own personal livelihood and situation. So we're not at all saying those sort of more ESG things are need to be put on the back burner. We're absolutely not saying that. It's just also making sure alongside that there is that emphasis on the very personal, and that's very clear in employee comms in the coming weeks and months.
Yes, totally. Thanks, James. Okay, well, I think that we have a quiet audience today, but we will be sending a follow-up note following this session. We've developed a white paper which captures and collates all of our points that we've talked through today. And of course, we can be available for any questions following this session. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, James and Tom, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you.